Hello everyone. This is a continuation of my video about sentence patterns. The first video looked at kind of an overview of information that we needed to know before we started putting sentences together, and then it included sentence pattern 1 and sentence pattern 2. This video will look at the last two sentence patterns, which are sentence pattern 3 and sentence pattern 4. Now, these are not the only sentence patterns that exist in the English language, but they are the basic sentence patterns that exist, and you can tweak them a little bit. But if you can write the four sentence patterns and the renditions that I've showed you here, you'll be in excellent shape. As I said in the first video, we could write everything in sentence pattern 1, simple sentence, but that would make our work choppy and immature. On the other hand, if we were to take sentence pattern 4 in its two renditions and write everything in sentence pattern 4, that would make our writing hard to understand. So what we want to have in good writing is a nice variety of correct sentence patterns. Now, sometimes we read work that has a variety of incorrect sentence patterns. That's not so good and not what we're aiming at. But we want to aim at having a nice variety of correct sentence patterns. Sentence pattern 3, particularly the first rendition, sentence pattern 3A, is a sentence pattern that people write all the time. The thing that gets in the way is they don't punctuate it correctly. So sentence pattern 3 is called a complex sentence, and not complex meaning it's hard, because it's one of the most easily written sentence patterns. But somebody decided that that would be a good name for it, so it is a complex sentence, and it consists of one independent clause and one dependent clause. Now, we already know what an independent clause is, so now we're going to look at what a dependent clause looks like. So we basically turn an independent clause into a dependent clause by adding a subordinating conjunction. We've already heard about coordinating conjunctions. Conjunction, junction, what's your function, from the old grammar videos, the grammar songs. Well, a subordinating conjunction sort of makes sense the same way a coordinating one does. When we coordinate something, we join it together. So coordinating conjunctions join sentences together. Subordinating conjunctions make an independent clause dependent. Now, before you begin to get ready to turn this off and say this is mumbo jumbo and she's talking a foreign language, think about it. Dependent and subordinate mean the same thing. They mean you can't stand by yourself. You are dependent on, subordinate to something else. So a dependent clause is not a complete sentence, but we can take a complete sentence and transform it into a dependent clause, an incomplete sentence, by adding a subordinating conjunction. Now, here are some examples. These are not all of the possible examples, but these are examples of subordinating conjunctions. When a sentence starts with one of these words, you will have a comma at the end of the dependent clause. Again, people write this sentence pattern often, but the most common error is forgetting the comma at the end of the dependent clause. So as you are typing sentences, if your sentences are starting with any of these words, and words like these is not an inclusive list, you need to be looking for where that clause ends and put a comma, and then you continue to the independent clause. So let's take a look. So we have an independent clause. The students write well. We turn that into a dependent clause by saying things like, although the students write well, if the students write well. These are not complete sentences. We could say when the students write well, while the students write well, because the students write well. It turns this independent clause into a dependent clause. Now there are more examples of sentence pattern 3 than the 2 I'm going to show you. For the purpose of simplicity and for the purpose of you getting a lot of correct sentence patterns understood and written, I'm not going to give you more than 2 examples here. So the first example is the one you write all the time. Dependent clause, comma, independent clause. The thing that people forget is the comma here. So if the students write well, comma, then we start a new sentence and add that second, the independent clause onto the end. They will get a good grade on the quiz. So that's sentence pattern 3A. Sentence pattern 3B simply turns this around. The students will get a good grade on the quiz if they write well. And we'll note here, if the subordinating conjunction is the first word in the sentence, as it is here, then you need a comma after the dependent clause. If the subordinating conjunction is in the middle of the sentence, as it is here it is in the middle of the sentence, you don't put a comma before it. Now, once in a great while, you'll write a sentence where you want to put some significant emphasis on the end, on the dependent clause. If that's the case, you might possibly put a comma here, or you might put a dash here, which is, a whole nother dimension. But for now, we'll say that almost always, if this dependent clause is at the end of the sentence, you don't put a comma before it. Sometimes people put a comma before because, and I will always say you never put a comma before because unless because is starting a quote. So if because is here in the middle of the sentence, then you won't put a comma before it. If because starts up here, because the students write well, comma, then you do use the comma. And it's just kind of sensible. If you were talking this, at the end of this dependent clause, you would take a quick breath and continue to the independent clause. All right, this is sentence pattern 4. Sentence pattern 4 is kind of the most, it's got the most moving parts to it. I'm not going to say it's difficult. It's not difficult. And some of you write this, but again, people who write this typically don't punctuate it correctly. So sentence pattern 4 is called a compound complex sentence. The reason why is not to be scary, but because it is a compound sentence, which we already know means it has 2 independent clauses, and it's a complex sentence because it has 1 dependent clause. So it has a dependent clause, 2 independent clauses. Compound, complex. We're going to look at 2 examples. And again, there are more examples, but we're going to look at just 2 examples for the purpose of getting ourselves a really good start with sentence patterns here. So the first one is 4A. This one starts with a dependent clause. Then it has an independent clause. Then we toss in a coordinating conjunction and a dependent clause. Now let's inspect it though and see that that's not really awful. So let's just say that the reason why this is a complex sentence, if the students write well, comma, they will get a good grade on the quiz. We could stop it right there, which would mean it would be sentence pattern 3A, a complex sentence, independent clause, and then a dependent clause. But we're going to now say, comma, coordinating conjunction, remember there's 7 of them, the fanboys conjunctions, they will be excited. So let's get rid of this and say they will get a good grade on the quiz, comma, and they will be excited. That's sentence pattern 2. So that's a compound sentence. So we've got the complex sentence to start with, and then we've got the compound sentence. So dependent clause, independent clause, independent clause. Come down here. This is kind of even easier here. So an independent clause, coordinating conjunction, dependent clause, independent clause. So in this case, we did just the opposite. We've got an independent clause, so this one can't start with a subordinating conjunction. This one starts with a simple sentence. The students write well, and so here we've got our connector, just like we do here, comma, and if they get a good grade on the quiz, comma, they will be excited. So we've got the same stuff here. We've just put it together differently. So this one starts with a dependent clause. So sentence pattern 4A has to start with a subordinating conjunction. Want that list of conjunctions and others like it. This one has to have a coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction right beside each other. So a fanboy conjunction and a subordinating conjunction right beside each other in the middle of a sentence. People write this. This is not an uncommonly written sentence pattern. It's an uncommonly correctly punctuated sentence pattern. So independent clause, comma, coordinating conjunction, fanboy conjunction, and then a dependent clause, comma, independent clause. You can make this hard, or you can look at it and go, okay, I get it. We're talking about complete sentences, and we're talking about dependent clauses, which are not complete sentences, but still have a subject and a verb, and we recognize them by signal words, like these signal words that say this is a dependent clause. So when you see a piece of a sentence starting with words like this, then that's a signal that says, hello, I am introducing a dependent clause, and you're going to have to put me together with one independent clause for sentence pattern 3, or with two independent clauses for sentence pattern 4. So I will be looking forward to seeing examples of these sentence patterns in your writing. And I'm already seeing examples of them, but they're not always punctuated correctly. So hopefully this will help.